Okay, my name is Frances Malkin, Fran, or Faye as my family called me. I was born in 1938 in a town called Sokol, which at that time was Poland. Polish was my first language, and I don't speak it anymore. I was born in 1938. In 1938 is when Germany declared war on Poland, and England declared war on Germany. And Poland was divided between the Soviet Union, Russia today, and Germany. Our section became part of the Soviet section. Sokol is near Lvov, which is the main city in the area, and it's about an hour from there. It's now in the Ukraine, both of these towns, but it was right on the border. There were 6,000 Jews who lived in Sokol. The other population was Polish and Ukrainian. When the communists came in, they took everything away because this my mother told me, under communism, you have no personal freedom. The government owns everything. So my mother and father had a confectionery store. They would import goods from all over Europe. Her family were in the cattle business. They would ship cattle all over Europe. And their life was good. They were comfortable. There was a nice culture in Sokol. I have some photos of them, which I wasn't able to bring, very few. And then, so the Soviets, when they came in, my mother lost their business, they lost their income, they lost their lives. And because under communism, nobody had anything. And when they took it away from the government, it wasn't anything. So in 1941, the Germans entered our town. Now, I was 2.5 years old at the time, so I'm going to refer to a diary that my mother's brother kept, my uncle. You see, when I came to this country, I was 10 years old and never spoke to my family about the Holocaust experience. So my first 10 years of life were there, and then I came here and I wiped it out. Nobody spoke about it, none of the Jews did. Now, when my mother's brother passed away, his sons had his diary translated into English and published it. I would like to read you a few paragraphs. He describes it. The Germans captured all of Sokol on June 22, 1941. Less than an hour after fighting broke out between the armies of Hitler and Stalin, the Ukrainian population, who had pretended to be staunch communists under the Soviets, welcomed the columns of Nazi tanks with bouquets of flowers and shouts of Heil Hitler. As a reward for their cooperation, the Ukrainian turncoats who had run the town under the Russians were allowed to keep their jobs under the Germans. Sokol was a town that had about 20-some thousand population. There were 6,000 Jews, there were Polish, and there were the Ukrainians. A Ukrainian by the name of Chernetsky was appointed mayor of Sokol and immediately organized the Ukrainian militia to carry out the orders of the Germans. On June 30th, 1941, all Jewish males between the ages of 14 and 60 were ordered to report to the town square. When the Jews arrived at the Targowice, he uses, I guess, the Polish word for it, a crowd of Ukrainians was already there, waiting for them, dressed in their Sunday best, as if they had all been invited to a party. Some big shots took over and announced that 400 Jewish males were required for labor assignments. Then they proceeded to select 400 professionals, businessmen, workers, and ordinary able-bodied individuals, and turned them over to a detachment of SS men. Those were just killing squads of the German. Among the 400 selectees was Eli Letzter, my sister Leah's husband. Now, they went out when the Germans promised they would give them jobs. They didn't have jobs for the last 2 years under the Soviets. So the 400 were marched off to a brick factory just outside Sokol. There they were shot and their bodies tossed into a mass grave. That is how my sister lost her husband and my baby niece, Faye, her father. I don't remember my father. I was 2.5 years old. My mother told me that, he went, before he went out, he picked me up, he hugged me, he kissed me, he cried. Maybe he had a premonition. But because everything in town, they had no work, no income, nothing, so he went out. And the Germans always said, "We're taking you to work." If you've seen pictures of Auschwitz, they say, "Arbeit macht frei," which is work makes you free. So my first memories are, they opened the ghetto some months later. And I was, I guess, 3.5 at that point. And all the Jews had to come into the ghetto, move into the ghetto. I think what they did all over, the Germans did all over Europe, was they created ghettos in the cities where there were Jews and had all the Jews come in the ghettos. Because Hitler's plan, he had 2 plans. One was to conquer the world, and he did pretty good job of that at that time until he was stopped. And the other was to kill every Jew in the world, because he saw Jews as a different race, that it was in their blood. They were Jewish. So if you converted to Christianity, it didn't save you because you were Jewish. And the Jews that were supposed to be killed were all up to the 3rd generation. So when you had a ghetto, all the Jews were forced to come into one place. In our town, there was a barbed wire around it. And you didn't have to go hunting for Jews. They were all located in one place. It was very clever there. There was a train that ran from our town these were cattle cars, to a place called Belzec. Now, Belzec isn't known because it was a death camp. You hear about Auschwitz because it was a work camp and a death camp. Like they needed the Jewish labor to help them to dispose of the people they killed, which is a crude way of saying it. So the way they did it in the ghettos, they would have an action, they call them actions. The Germans would come storming in to the ghetto, round up as many Jews as they got a hold of. In the action, they would put them on the cattle cars in Sokal. What they told them was, we're not going to kill you, we're going to take you to work. Now, bring all your belongings with you, money, food, anything. The full cattle cars went off from the railroad station about an hour away to Belzec. When they got to Belzec, they'd say, we're not going to kill you. We're going to take you to work. Bring everything with you. But first you have to take a shower. And then they went into the showers, and this was common. If you were lucky in places, water would come out. If you were not lucky, gas would come out. Belzec was, only gas would come out. Nobody survived Belzec. I've heard about 800,000 Jews were murdered in Belzec. So my mother had she had two brothers, two sisters. One of the brothers worked at the railroad station, and their job was to clean the Jewish men who worked for the railroad station, was to clean the cars when they came back empty from Belzec. And what they'd find was identification papers from people about 18 years old, dollar bills torn into small pieces. I'm telling you things that I was at that point 3.5 years old. I'm telling you from the diary what I know. Otherwise, I'll tell you things I remember. And there was a lot of disease in the ghetto. There was hunger. A lot of Jews died in the ghetto. I had typhus. I was 4 years old, 3.5. I had typhus. Many people died from it. You got very high fevers at night, and people would become delirious. And there was no medication, so either you died or you lived. The second action, I'll tell you one incident I remember. Somebody, I guess my mother somebody grabbed my hand, and we would have these hiding places that we put up in the ghettos. And there was a pantry somewhere in that house, and I was sitting on my grandfather's lap the whole time. And the Germans were all around rounding up any Jews they could find. And a little boy started crying. Crying was very dangerous for children in the war. That he's thirsty. And we whispered, he's got to drink something. They couldn't stop him. So his father urinated into a cup and gave him to drink. That was the second action. Since my uncles worked for the railroad, he knew what was coming. The third action was going to be the final one. So he would sneak out of the ghetto at night under the barbed wire. And my family lived in Sokal for many generations, going back to the 1700s. And they knew all the people because they had, they did business with them, they had dealings with them, they were their neighbors. And he asked them to hide his family. And they were he was turned down everywhere because you couldn't blame them. If you were discovered hiding Jews, they would murder you and your family. So it was a very dangerous thing to try to hide a Jew. Plus, there was an incentive given to the population to turn in their neighbors if they were hiding Jews. He went to see Miss Francesca Halamayava. They knew her. She lived with her daughter, Helena. Francesca must have been in her 50s. At that time, Helena was in her 20s. He had spoken to Francesca's brother, but he was afraid to take us in. And Francesca said, yeah, I'll hide your family. So when the third action happened, and my family knew it was the last one, they had a sister who was very sick. She had tuberculosis. So they wanted a doctor with them. So they got a very prominent doctor, Dr. David Kindler in town, his wife and 2 sons. We lived along the Book River in our town, which divided our town. And so we walked along the river to Francesca's house that night. I remember, I guess at that point I was probably almost 4. And I remember the walk, and we got there. Little houses. If any of you have been back in some of these small towns, Poland, or some of them are in Ukraine now, everybody's next to each other. And we got to her house. She sent us in the back of the house to her barn. She had pigs downstairs, and there was a ladder that led up to a trap door. And we walked up there. We moved the trap door. We walked into the hay loft because there was hay on the straw on the floor, and it was this type of a roof. And there were 13 of us there. Before we left, I was the youngest. There were 2 other children. They had, my mother's 2 brothers had the speech with me. Children cry. That's why I told you the other story. These houses are very close to each other. If you cry, we'll be destroyed because we'll be found out. The neighbors will report her, and we'll all be captured. And there were 13 of us plus the 2 Halamayavas. They would have been murdered too. So I promised I wasn't going to cry. And when I got there, and I think it happened pretty soon, I started crying. Can I read you a portion? I don't know if I have the time, from the diary where he explains it. Anybody have any questions now? I hope I didn't. I'm trying to simplify it as much as I can. Because I do want to tell you, the decision at that point when one of my uncles said, don't take her, what he suggested, they weren't going to leave me, was to put me in front of a church or a convent. And usually the priests or the nuns would take little children or babies in. And many of those children who survived, their parents never came back. They were murdered. And are finding out these last few years that they were Jewish. They never knew it. And there was a very good Polish woman, a movie made, Ida, I-D-A, that tells that story. She becomes a nun. But she has finally learned the story. So that was a not uncommon practice. So now, anybody have any comments, questions?
Now is the time for questions. Does anybody have a question they would like to ask?
Yeah.
What was the reason you stopped speaking
That was after the war. My family, it wasn't just my family, many of the Jews, there were 3 children, and when we'd walk around screaming, speaking Polish, they said after what we went through, we were in a place, I remember we were in Hungary, and we were in a big place, and somebody said to us, stop speaking Polish. In my case, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a Polish Catholic woman and her daughter, but that didn't happen to everybody. So when I got up there, I started crying, and this I remember. My little 4-year-old niece, Leah's daughter, Faye, won't stop crying. We all beg her to keep quiet. We give her toys, holiday gifts to divert her, but nothing helps. Mrs. Holomayova comes up to us and says, for mercy's sake, can't you people make that child stop crying? Do you want the Germans to find you and kill us all? She takes a stick and begins to beat the pigs. She hopes their squeaks of pain will drown out the sound of Faye's crying. The hours go by. Faye is still crying. We are all terrified. Mrs. Holomayova and Hella are still beating the pigs, but how much longer can they keep this up? And how much longer will the poor little pigs be able to stand this? At about 8 o'clock that evening, Mrs. Holomayova knocks on a hayloft door with her stick. That's how she communicated. We open the door. You'll have to do something, she says, very much upset. If this crying goes on, it'll be the end of all of us. We promise her that we will do something. After she has left, we huddle together and discuss what we should do. We come to a terrible decision. We will have to kill Faye with poison from Dr. Kindler's medical bag. We can't endanger 14 other lives, those of our family, the Kindlers, the doctor, and the 2 Holomayovas, because of one child. We report our decision to Mrs. Holomayova. She doesn't say a word. What could she say? Faye goes on crying. We cover Faye with blankets. Dr. Kindler pours a spoonful of poison from one of his vials and forces the spoon between Faye's lips. Faye makes a face, spits it out, and keeps on crying. I remember a pill, but maybe it was both. Finally, some of the poison seems to stay in. After a few minutes, Faye stops crying. Her eyes fall shut. She appears unconscious. She does not seem to be breathing. We all squat around the little figure, lying on the straw as if we were already sitting Shiva after the funeral. No one makes a sound. My sister Leah, Faye's mother, does not weep. I forgive you for what you have done to my child, she whispers, as long as God forgives you too. One life for a chance to save 14 other lives. My mother said her plan was, when they took me down, to jump down and jump in the river next door, the Book River that ran next door. 2 hours later, at about 10 o'clock, Mrs. Holomayova comes to us holding out a large burlap bag. The child's soul is with God now, she says in a voice that betrays no emotion. Put her in this bag. I'll bury her. Dr. Kindler leans forward to pick up the limp little body from the straw. As he touches the child, his sensitive hands feel something unexpected. He motions to me and whispers in my ear, "There's a pulse. It's faint, but I can feel it. This child is alive." it takes a moment to grasp what the doctor is saying. Then I say that if the child wasn't killed by the dose of poison he gave her, it is nothing short of a miracle. Faye was meant to live. We spent 22 months there in this hayloft. There were a number of incidents. I know I don't have the time to say how we were caught, almost caught. We were liberated in July 1944 by the Soviet Union before Auschwitz because we were right on the Russian border. And that's when my mother found out what happened to my father and the other 400 Jewish men. And she says, there's no life for us here anymore, and we left. I just want to tell you, if I have it quickly, one incident that I remember. The Ukrainians and the Poles were enemies also at that time. I don't know. Okay. They would put notices on her door, you must leave. They wanted her property, and they were running the town under the Germans. So they said, she said, if we have to leave, we'll all be caught. We will, maybe we can save one child. So first they took down the doctor's son. He was also 4 years old. And he was a beautiful little blonde boy, blue eyes. They took him down. But then they brought him back because at that time only Jewish boys were circumcised. And a lot of Jewish men had that danger. And there was a good movie, Europa, tells you that story. So then they decided to give him a shot with me, though they didn't trust me too much. So at that point, she went to the priest and she said, I found this little girl wandering around. I need Polish papers and we're gonna take her. They gave me a name, Marysia Janusz, and they taught me all the prayers, Patras, I think they called it. You know, every day in hiding, I had to say the prayers. And I remember saying to my mother, maybe I was 5 at that point, because we were there for almost 2 years. Let me look at you. I know what was going on. I might never see you again. And everybody started crying. And they took me down, and Helena, at that point, had gotten married, and they took me to Lvov. But they kept me hidden in the house because they were afraid, you know, a child might say anything. So that was an incident. There were others. That one I want to tell you about.
Francis, I'm sorry to interrupt you right now, but perhaps right now we could just give some time for the students to ask any questions if they have anything more for you, and then we shall continue with Zosia Sherman, okay? And of course we will continue the conversations after this main part, okay? So don't worry about it. All the guests, all the ladies can tell you more when we have the part after the main one.